Yeah, it's called Conversations with Jeff, not Screaming Matches.
Yeah, you and I do not agree on Calvinism. But look how nice we are to each other.
I think it's going to really shock a lot of people, thrill a lot of people. A lot of people are going to have to do some soul searching.
It's like, you know what? What are you doing? You're spending all your time trying to destroy another Christian day because you don't understand what's going on, when you should be out there winning people for Jesus.
Right.
Thank you for the job you're doing. Thanks for being willing to address these kind of issues. They're vital to the church.
I feel sorry for what's coming your way, but God bless you, man. It's a good, healthy conversation, and let's keep growing together in the Lord.
People won't change unless they hear the truth, though. And so we need to know the truth, speak the truth, and then the last one I would say is that we need to stay in the truth, no matter what the consequences are.
Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of Conversations with Jeff. Thanks so much for tuning in. Just a reminder before we get started, if you guys would like to support what we're doing here with the Gatekeepers, one way that you can do that is with our Plugged In membership. Go to gatekeepersonline.com/plugged-in. It's something that you guys can help support us. It's $10 a month. You get a bunch of extra perks and benefits, everything including 30% off of everything in our bookstore. You get access to our Destroy Social Justice conference. I'm also going to be starting a podcast that will be streaming live for members only, as well as we're going to start throwing in some extra perks and benefits and everything for you as well. So definitely something to check out, gatekeepersonline.com/plugged-in. And one other thing really quick, if you guys pre-order our book, Church and State, How the Left Used the Church to Conquer America, gatekeepersonline.com/store, use code Jeff at checkout for 10% off. That's going to be available within the next couple of weeks. So definitely check that out. Really excited about today's guest. We've got Debbie DeGroff joining us. Debbie, welcome to Conversations with Jeff. Glad we could sit down and we could chat here for a little bit.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, and so you wrote the book Between the Covers, and it's really interesting because it's something that I think that a lot of Christians have been concerned about, but I don't think everybody knows the extent of what's actually in all of the children's books, and you've done a very, very good job of exposing for parents to understand what's actually going on. What inspired you to write this book and really dive into this topic?
Well, I had always been a voracious reader, but I started taking my kids to the library when my oldest child learned how to read. This was over 3 decades ago. And I started checking out all of the latest acquisitions, the new books with the shiny covers. And I found things weren't as I remembered the books to be. So I kept reading and reading and reading. And of course, when you start out with juvenile books, they do not take very long to read. Parents seem to have the misconception that if they start reading what their children want to read before they do, that it's going to take them the rest of their life. But it really doesn't. Some of those books take an adult 15, 20 minutes to read of the juvenile ones. So that's how I started and just kept moving up, and it's been a long, long journey, and I've had to learn a lot of things about education issues. I learned a lot from Dr. Judith Reisman about Kinsey because that was applicable to the research that I was doing. So, it's been hard, but it's been good. I never wanted to write a book. I only wanted to just teach parents so that they would know that they needed to look between the covers and find out what exactly their kids were reading.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things that's so important is that, and I always say this about entertainment in general, whether it's movies or television or even books and things like that, is it has this ability to influence people without them even realizing it. And I think that's kind of the dangerous subtlety, I guess you could say, of a lot of these books is that kids are reading them and they just take it at face value, and then now it's influencing future generations without any kind of pushback or correction or anything like that.
I think that you put that very succinctly, that if there was one message that I wanted parents to get, it is exactly what you just repeated right there. And they have no idea the influence that these books have on the children. Number one, when you read it as an adult, you're looking at it from a different perspective. You're bringing all the knowledge that you have, filling in the blanks. For example, if someone gave half a scripture, as an adult that's versed in the scripture, you might not even realize they didn't finish the scripture because you finished it in your head. And it's the same thing when the kids are reading this, they're at a disadvantage. They do not realize what is being omitted. They do not realize the fallacies and that their worldviews are shifting. And the problem, Jeff, is that for years, parents have assumed that books were somehow safe and neutral. You know, they worried about movies or they worried about television, but books are safe and neutral, and nothing could be further than the truth. Usually those ideologies are reflected in children's books before they're reflected in the television and the movies and become mainstream.
Yeah, and that's really interesting too. And and I think like a lot of times we think, okay, well, so these kids, they're going to public schools, they're probably getting lefty talking points and things like that. But I don't think that parents really fully understand not only what are they being taught in schools, but also what's in the books that the kids are actually being assigned to read. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's going to be a big eye opener for a lot of parents.
Well, first I would like to clarify that normally homeschoolers learned how to read phonetically. Normally, they're better readers. So who reads more? And when you have homeschool parents who are so careful about their children's friends, what they watch, all these different things, but because it's free, they take them to the library more often, assuming that they're safe and neutral. And so often it is homeschoolers that are affected also. So I do not want to leave it that it is just, public school children. Another problem while we're dealing with this area is Christian schools typically have a lower budget. I think we could agree to that, right?
Right.
And so when they try to establish a library, a lot of times it's dependent on grandma and mommy going to book sales and yard sales and picking up children's books. And when you look at the covers, you have no idea because no one would anticipate that there is this much in children's books. Now, without being explicit on your podcast, let me say that major publishing companies have everything from sadomasochism, anal sex, oral sex, fisting, homosexual sex, heterosexual sex. There is nothing that is left out. In fact, if it can be viewed in hardcore porn, it is done textually in books for teens.
Yeah, and see, like that's the crazy thing in all of this is that we have all these laws that are supposed to be there to protect kids from this sort of thing, but for whatever reason, when it comes to it being in written form or illustrated or whatever it might be, all of a sudden now it's okay because it's literature, it's in a book. How do we even get to that point to where the adults that are making these decisions think that this is appropriate?
Well, I'm not sure that they think it's appropriate. I think they know that they're corrupting. But when you read the obscenity laws, technically text is included. Okay, now there's a couple of factors here. First of all, in about 43 states, there are obscenity exemptions. This means that schools and libraries are not held to the same standard. Some of this, if you read to my grandchildren, you'd be in jail for a long time, and when you got out, you would be a registered sex offender. But when it's done on libraries and in school situation, it's considered educational. Okay? However, and I'm not a book censor. There's a big difference between censorship, free speech, and obscenity. Obscenity is against the law, and obscenity has harsher penalties when it applies to children. Okay? So your publishing companies that are marketing this to children, they don't have those protections. So you have to ask yourself, how is it that they're getting away with that? Well, most of them are owned by the 6 big corporations. So they've got more money than you do to go after them. They could keep you until they had bled you dry. Okay, and then what happens? If you look at all the obscenity arguments through the decades, they have to do with one book. If you go back and you look at Allen Ginsberg and his books, okay, one, or Henry Miller. So what are we going to do? Take every book out of a library, read one at a time, and file a lawsuit against all these various publishers one at a time? It's not going to happen, and they know that. And they keep pushing the limit, and they're pushing the limit and pushing the limit. And I can tell you quite honestly, there's not a lot you're going to be able to do to change that as far as lawsuits. But I don't know why it's easier for parents to want to go complain, so to speak. It's easier to do that than it is to say, hey, I'm going to take a look at what my children are reading. And when it comes down to it, that's your first course of action. And one other thing that a parent can do, I can't tell you that this is true for every single library that they enacted. And I think some states are trying to counter this. But if you have a child with a library card, you can't check what they've checked out. That's in the Library Bill of Rights. So the best thing that a parent could do, since if your child is a minor, who's driving them there? You are, okay? You have a library card. So does it make any difference whether you sign it out or they sign it out? They're still going to get the book, but it's going to be under your name. So that is one thing where you can have a little bit of control.
Yeah. Now, and I know you had said, specifically with like homeschool parents and families and things like that. This is also a problem again, because I grew up homeschooled. My entire education was reading, and things like that. But when you're dealing with homeschool parents, is this typically coming in through going to the library, or is this just them just thinking, oh, well, this looks like a kid's book, I'm going to buy it for my kids to read, and they take it home? How is that usually happening within the homeschool community?
My guess would be the library. Most homeschool parents are trying to survive normally on one income, and you just don't have unlimited money just to, buy books willy-nilly all the time without careful thought. So, my guess is it's typically through the library. Now, one more thing, if your child has a library card, and mind you, you cannot check what they've been checking out, they also have ebooks. And, some of them, I have one that teaches teens fisting and how to take care of their sex toys and all of that here in West Virginia. That is a regular West Virginia Reads ebook. So while you think your child is home, not running around with a bad crowd or doing drugs, they could be in their room just instantly having these books downloaded to their device.
Yeah, which again is scary, but it's also scary that it's coming from essentially a government-run institution, and I think that's a whole other ballgame, because I think a lot of times we trust like the library. It, like when you say it in your mind, you're thinking that's a neutral place. Like there's not going to be anything that's that's awful or off limits or whatever it is, but there's still plenty of stuff that's there.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
No doubt. And something different if people are, I'm a grandmother. So for people my age that remembers their pleasant visits to a library when they were children, one thing you knew, quiet. It was quiet. You didn't talk. You were so excited to be there and to be able to choose a book. Well, now they've got lock-ins and pajama parties and reading to a dog, like that's going to enhance your reading skills. Okay? The drag queen story hour. Everything goes on in a library except for reading anymore. A large percentage of the people go there just to use the computers. And a lot of that is just playing games or answering their emails. You have a lot of pedophiles who've been discovered, in libraries that are sitting on those computers. And some have no filters where they're actually watching porn. So, that's a separate issue, what goes on with inside the library. But my focus is what is between the covers.
Right. And I think specifically when it comes to that as well, I think a lot of times, obviously, we all agree that there's a lot of sexual themes that are in these books, and way too young and things like that. But there's also ideological issues, and that I think is the more subtle, but maybe even more dangerous, or at least equally as dangerous, because we're literally from a young age, putting into their minds these leftist talking points and belief systems, into where now, when we're looking at the generation that's like behind me, the 20-somethings, I'm looking at them, and they're almost all progressives. They're almost all full-on Black Lives Matter, Democrats, socialist, all that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of it, we have to look back at the books that they read.
You're absolutely right. And it isn't just the sexuality and the profanity. And I will add here that I have one book that has over 1,300 F words that was published by the children's division of Simon & Schuster. But even more dangerous is the ideologies that you're putting into these children's heads. Now, a lot of these books that the progressive parents are buying for their children or are being read in preschools to the children start at birth. They start at birth. It's incredible to me when you look at the age range. Most of those are really geared from around 3 to 7. And you have climate change, you have sustainability, you have every variation of LGBT, anything that you can think of, Marxist ideology, lots of that. The Greta Thunberg, you have all of hers, we've got to panic, the house is burning down. And the thing that's different with these books for the very, very young is they are generally picture books. Okay, when you buy a picture book, the pages are normally a lot thicker, which means it's a lot more expensive than the book that you just put out, right? And you've got a really nice hardcover, and you've got professional illustrators. So as a parent, if you are buying those books for your children, you're paying a pretty good dollar for those books. Now, how many times do you read a picture book to a child? Over and over and over till you never want to see that book again. Okay? And so how many times are they getting that idea planted in their head? One of the articles on my website, which is what'sinsidechildrensbooks.com, is about Clara Lemlich, and it's about the Shirtwaist Factory strike of 1909. Okay, but if they look at that on my site, they can watch it on YouTube. Somebody reads the whole book. They don't have to take my word for it. They read the whole book and look at the pictures and then read what I wrote about the Clara book. One of the first questions you should ask is, why was it so important? I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there. How did that happen? How did that happen? There we go. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Okay. Number one, why would you choose a book on Clara Lemlich? She was a communist. Okay? In 1909, she wasn't card-carrying. She was already a revolutionary, but she wasn't card-carrying. But her son is actually mentioned in the Venona papers. You know, he was one responsible for spying with the Soviets. So why would it be so important that that's a book? Hey, that's the one I want my kids to read about the shirtwaist factory strike. You see, it doesn't make sense. You've got to start asking questions. And then when you start going through the book, you see the propaganda. And you have to, as a parent, ask yourself, what is the takeaway that my child is going to have? It's not the same takeaway you have because you know about these issues. But that child gets an affinity with the character, and they're easily shifted, just like you said at the very beginning. So this is the part that is more dangerous than the blatant sexuality.
Yeah, and I think too, like a lot of times, what we see, I feel like from the left is a lot of times not talking about the specifics or the details, especially when it comes to history. A lot of times, like when I hear people that are my age or younger, oftentimes what I'm hearing is these overgeneralized, like, America was founded on racism. It was, we abused the Native Americans. But then when you get into specifics, there were instances, yes. There were also instances where it wasn't systemic and things like that. But that takes nuance. It takes understanding history and what happened and people. But I think oftentimes when you look at these kids' books, it's just the big overall general theme, and then it's pushing a particular narrative. And then now everybody's all grown up and they're just parroting all the talking points that they've heard growing up.
Yes, you're right. That's part of the problem. People forget. They think that children, they'll grow out of it. No, you don't grow out of it. You get a bad habit, and a bad habit is hard to break. But this is all these children know, and these children have grown up. And so one of the things that's very interesting for parents to do, if there's a particular ideology, let's just say, in the last decade, the transgender issue has really been pushed heavily, right? Well, you can go back and you can see that the transgender book started in 2004 for kids. You see? So whatever it is, you can go back and you think in 2004, that was 16 years ago. So if the kid was 10 reading that might be your community leader today. So whether it's Marxist ideology, whatever it is, these kids have grown up. You can look at the Islam issue, and oh my goodness. I mean, if anything, you would hate Israel with a passion after you read these children's books.
Yeah, and I think specifically with the Islam issue, I know that several years ago there was a lot of talk about out here in California of teaching it in schools and reinforcing it, and like they were even having like kids say the prayers as if they would ever do that with Christians, but they would do that with Islamic things and teaching tolerance and all that kind of stuff. But what are some of the things that kids are reading in the books that maybe parents aren't as aware about?
You mean other than Islam?
Well, or maybe even like pertaining to Islam. What are some of like the main like talking points and things that they're trying to teach the kids about this to try to push a particular narrative?
Well, they try to instill that Israel is just a great occupier that is just going in willy-nilly because it's something to do today, and they're just annihilating people and homes, and it's so insidious. I can't explain it exactly, but I do have 3-part article on my website where I took a lot of the books and broke them down so that they could understand what the child is left with. Now, those also start at preschool. Now, in the picture books, they start out by just having, the hijab, a lot of books like that, or talking about Ramadan. And when you get done as a little child, you wish your mommy had those because they're so stylish and they're so pretty and you want to wear one. That's the biggest thing. And they always have the nicest mommies. Okay? And then you move up to the juvenile. And so they start adding, what I'm noticing in the juvenile is the interfaith dialogue.
Yep. Yeah, which is all of my followers know that are watching this, like interfaith dialogue is really what got me into all of this like podcasting world was dealing with the dangers of that. So it's been a few years of talking about that quite a bit.
Right, and it is, as an adult, these interfaith dialogue people are so well trained that adults can sit there, a room full of them, and listen to these people and they think, oh my gosh, I never knew. We'd never know how to write or add or, we would still be on our horses and all of that if it was not for Islam, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you expect a child to think when they get done? Now, the interfaith dialogue, since you're very, very familiar with that, one thing I noticed, I go and look at, public library sites all across the nation. And I have noticed that the books that are pushing that for juvenile, the schools don't have, or the public libraries do not have one copy or two copies. I mean, it is multiple copies, and it's in audiobook form or CD or a book. Now that says a lot. When you start looking at books are a dime a dozen. But when you see books that are in all of the schools with that same message, you know that that's the important message that they're trying to get across to the kids.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think too, like one of the interesting things that you were talking about was that, things that are showing up in children's literature, that's almost a precursor for what's going to be in like the movies and things like that. Yeah. And then from there, then it's a precursor for what we're going to start seeing in society and all of that overall. What are some of the things that are being talked about in children's books today where we can kind of begin to look into the future and see, okay, this is what they're pushing for in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, right now, for the past few years, it's pushing ever since the Trayvon Martin. Okay, and I don't know if you've watched Joel Gilbert's Trayvon Martin hoax about where they switched the witness.
No, have not seen that one. I probably should, though.
Yes, you should. Probably have him on your show. But anyway, so many of these children's books, not all of them will say Trayvon's name. A lot of them do. But they're setting it up where the black kids, it's scary for them. I mean, you've got to put yourself in their place. They really believe from everything that they're reading and seeing and being indoctrinated in that they're just open game for somebody, to just blow them away if they go out. They're instilling a hatred, and racial problems where there ought not be any. But that's what these kids are believing. And then when you have the white kids, because these books are generally required now, so that you have the tolerance and and all of that, you have the white kids who have been trained to be social justice warriors. So you don't care what the cause is. They're trained. Okay? So now they can be a social justice warrior for Black Lives Matter, and all of these groups. So it's scary. But I tell you what, when you start reading those books, they are so brutal. There's one called Ghost Boys. And the first scene, and this one's for juvenile, okay? When the first scene is the little boy is basically looking down on his dead body where he was just shot because, of course, he was playing outside and his grandmother and his mother told him never to do this, but he was playing with a toy plastic gun, okay? And so, of course, here came a cop, and what did he do? He killed this little boy. And so the book details all these ghosts of, like Emmett Till and all these others that have been killed. And the cop that shot him's daughter, if I'm remembering right, she was about their age group, and she was able to communicate with that boy's ghost. So of course she learned about all of the wrongs and everything they had gone through, and hopefully how to rectify it. But, this is the thing. It just like a gay-straight alliance. If you were homosexual and I was your best friend, and I'm not, but I'm going to join the gay-straight alliance to show my support for you. See, it works the same way with this. They know how it works.
Yeah, well, and I think that leads to the overarching question of, and obviously I know the answer, but I think it's an interesting thing to discuss, is this all intentional, or is this something where you're just having authors that just happen to be writing about these issues because this is what is their experience, or this is what's going on for them? Because I feel like the argument a lot of times, like when I talk about like movies, a lot of times, because I'll always say, look, this is propaganda, and in order for you to understand what's going on in a movie, so for the next 2 hours, you have to assume that global warming is real. You have to assume that white supremacy is a major issue in order for the movie to make sense. And so that's kind of like a brainwashing propaganda technique. And I think that a lot of times the response from the left is, you're just a conspiracy theorist. You're reading too much into it. It's just people that are sharing their perspective, kind of a thing. Is this that, or is this something that's more sinister where they're actually trying to push propaganda?
It's intentional. How could it be any other way? And if you're a writer, you can go online and go to these various publishers, and they're looking for more books that have to do with lesbian sex, or the Black Lives Matter or whatever. So they're deliberately looking for these types of books. So I guess my question would be, how many people publish good manuscripts that never see the light of day?
It is true, and it is interesting too, because it does seem like, and again, when it comes to movies, television, books, it seems like it's extremely dominated by the left. And then is that because conservatives and Christians aren't getting as involved, or is it because we're being pushed out? I've heard arguments both ways. What's your take on that?
Well, I would think that we were being pushed out, but let's look at some of these corporations. Who owns Zondervan and Thomas Nelson? See, under HarperCollins, and then News Corp, Rupert Murdoch. What is it that you expect? I can remember, probably 25, 30 years ago, when I, was early on doing this and finding books that were pure occult, that were originally published by Thomas Nelson. Now, who was buying those books? I mean, let's think about it. It was grandmas in a Christian bookstore buying those books for their kids, grandkids. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what kind of a perspective you put in all of that.
Yeah, well, and I think that's the scary thing too, where it seems like even within Christianity and Christian books and that sort of thing, you're seeing some of these themes popping up, both in adult books as well as in books for kids and fiction and like all that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of times too, it's like parents gotta understand like what's even in the Christian books that they're buying their kids to read, because there's a lot of these lefty talking points that are infiltrating in, and you would have no idea because you trust your local Christian bookstore.
Yeah, and you're going to see visualization. You're going to see, there's not much that you're not going to find in a so-called Christian book. You're going to find spirit guides. You're going to find, they're not negated. It's not like they have something that is against the scripture that God has given us, and then they talk about how it's remedied and how this was wrong. That doesn't happen. And a lot of Christian books are basically character books. You know, you can be very, very, very kind and still reject Christ.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that's something that I think, again, like parents and adults need to be aware, both for ourselves, because I think a lot of times it's really easy to pick up a Christian book and you're like, well, you know, I trust this, so I'm going to read it, and then understand the influence that it can have on adults, and then imagine how much more influence it's going to have on our Christian kids. And we got to wonder too, how much of this is influencing the steady stream, it seems like, of kids that graduate high school, they go to college, and then they turn into a socialist or Marxist or full-on lefty after being homeschooled their entire life, after being actively involved in church, and then all of a sudden they're walking away from their faith. Is it because all of these things have been planted, and then it's triggered when they go to college, and then they're hearing their professors saying everything that they've remember reading growing up?
Yeah, and it does happen, unfortunately, because whereas the homeschool child might not be out running and doing things that they're not supposed to do, but they might be avid readers. Now, if we could bring up a couple more points here when you talked about whether it's intentional or not. Okay, now the big push from publishers is to have authentic voices. Okay? So if you wanted to write a story, say, about homosexuality, then if you were a homosexual, then it has more weight than if I wrote the book and wasn't one. Okay? That's called authentic voices. So what's really interesting, that has nothing to do with whether you are an excellent writer. And in my book, I bring up Charles Dickens, you know, the old curiosity shop, if you remember Little Nell. And there were people lined up at the wharf in New York City waiting to see whether Nell lived or died. Now, I guarantee you Charles Dickens was not a 14-year-old girl. He wasn't an authentic voice, but he was such an excellent writer, and in his descriptions, that you had people knowing this is a fictional character, but still lined up waiting to see whether little Nell lived or died. Okay, so that is an important thing. So anybody who has an authentic voice for whatever the issues are that we're talking about trumps every other voice.
Yeah, well, and that is really interesting, and again, just even as the consumer on the other side, like you begin to see that a lot. In the books that are being pushed, because I get emails all the time, promoting, to, have people on that are authors of books or, whatever it is. And it always seems like it's always got to be somebody who has experience or like an expert in that background or field or whatever it is. It's never just like, this person's a good author. You know what I mean? It is interesting now that you mention that.
Yeah. And I don't know, that's one that really, really bothers me. You look at the book George, which is for 10-year-old. I mean, it's for juvenile. And that is about the little boy, George, who knows he's always been a girl. He's always been Melissa. Okay. Well, David Levithan, who is an author of young adult books, is also an editor at Scholastic. Well, this was Alex Gino, a transgender, that wrote this book. So David Levithan actually edited that book, which was a big thing. He had never written a book before, and they published 50,000 copies. Now, if you submit something, they're going to go to say, wow, we're just going to run off 50,000 copies, and wait to do a reprint. No, it doesn't happen. But they gave away 10,000 books free to schools and libraries, and paraded him around to all the book fairs. So do you think that they would have done that with a conservative? Yeah. Let's face it, it wouldn't have happened. So that's how it's done.
Yeah. Now, do you feel like there is enough conservative alternatives for parents to be able to be feeding their kids, a healthy, constant stream of books and resources? Do you feel like there's enough out there? It's not getting found, or is it that we need more conservative Christian voices that are contributing and writing and things like that?
Well, that's it's a really, really, really good question. I think that there's a lot of books that are older. Okay? Everybody and their mother puts out a book list of whatever is supposed to be good lists or bad lists. I do not do that. I deal with that in chapter 4 of my book, explaining why. Okay? If I give you a list of bad books, and I say, oh, please don't let your children read this, then any book that's not on that list you think is open game. Oh, that must be a good book because it's not on a bad book list. And what makes it bad? You and I are different. I'm not talking about doctrine, or things like that. There's so many little things. If you are a Democrat and hate Republicans with a passion, there's a lot of books out there today that you absolutely love because a Republican is worse than a Nazi pedophile. Okay? All right, so there's different things on there that people are going to disagree with. I never make those lists. A lot of the lists that I've seen that have, oh, these are the good books that kids could read, are not ones that I ever would have chosen as a mother. This isn't a control factor. This is a matter of, if you are my son and I am homeschooling you, there's a limited number of books that you can read in the time period that I'm homeschooling you. You can't read it all. There's thousands of kids' books that come out every month. Nobody can keep abreast of all of that. But what you've got to do is start reading when your children are young. Like I said, it doesn't take long when you're starting, and then you just kind of make a list. Oh, I like this one. If your kids are toddlers, go to the library one day. Put 30 books in your pile and sit down on one of their couches if a library is still open. And you could read all 30 of those books, and probably 27 of them you're not going to care for that much, but the 3 you do, make a note. And now if you have 10 children, you have a start. And these things are important. Make your own list. Don't be dependent on somebody else.
Yeah, and I think that's to me, I think one of the most important takeaways is, and again this goes back to a conservative principle, but personal responsibility of because I think one of the aspects too, and one of the problems with like a lot of the lists, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but everybody kind of has different standards when it comes to what they want their kids to be exposed to or not, and some may be a little bit less conservative, some may be more, and that's okay because it all depends on how you're parenting, how you're teaching, and all that kind of stuff. But I think that the biggest key is going to be the fact that what's going into your children's mind, whether it's television, movies, books, and things like that. And it is interesting that it seems like it's the books that parents worry about the least, yet at the same time, it may be the most dangerous.
I think you're right. Now, there are a lot of books that I read that they might have one little thing in there that I didn't care for, an ideology that could have planted a seed. But the book overall was an excellent book. It was somebody with, like you said, a different standard, a different point of view. And I would just say to my kids, hey, when you get to page so-and-so, let's talk about it. It wasn't a matter that you don't want them exposed to that idea. You want to be able to explain to them your perspective of that. So you don't throw out everything, for heaven's sakes, although a lot of it should be.
Yeah. Well, and I think that comes back to, how much we shelter versus how much we teach. And I think that there is a kind of a fine line of figuring out what is it that we completely, make sure we keep it out of our house, and what is it that we need to have a conversation about. And again, it's going to shift from person to person and family to family, and where you live in the country, and there's so many different variables with that. And that's where I do appreciate that you're not just taking like a one hardline stance of here's the list of yeses and nos and that's it.
Well, I think that's where some people get upset at me. They want me to be this big book censor, and every time there's an awful book, I'm supposed to go, somehow take care of it. You can't do that. What are you going to do? Seriously, pull every book out of a library, and then you form a committee of 12, and every week we read a separate one, and then we come to consensus about what we think about this one or that one. It's not plausible.
Yeah. Again, that's where I think parents in general need to have you got to take the time. You got to read the books. You got to understand what is going in to your kid's mind. So I really appreciate you coming on. Now, if people want more information, and I know you're writing articles and you've got your book and that sort of thing, if they want more information on the kind of stuff that we talked about today, what's the best way for them to either get in touch with you or read your stuff?
Well, they can get in touch with me by going to my website, which is what'sinsidechildrensbooks.com, no apostrophes, all lowercase. And there they can order a hard copy of my book. I do have an ebook on Kindle. My book is oversized. It's 8.5 by 11, so it's easier. It's more like a reference book and a textbook. So I recommend the hard copy. I made the Kindle version available because there were people internationally, and in Canada it was $17.25 just to ship a book. Yeah. Okay, so that's why I did that. But I have the contact information on there. I put up the articles periodically. They can learn everything from reading instructional methods to the different things that they need to look for and be concerned with in kids' books. Whole gamut of things, on the website.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, highly encourage everybody to do that. Again, just be aware, know what's going on, know what's in the books. It's vitally important, especially because we're seeing the results of all this influence. It's playing out in the streets today. I think if we would have known what's actually being taught and we could correct some of the stuff 20 years ago, a lot of this stuff maybe we could have thwarted a little bit. But yeah, Debbie, I really appreciate you coming on. I had a blast talking to you. Again, this is one of those things. I think it's something that a lot of people don't talk about enough, especially when it comes to the literature. So I'm really appreciative of you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And then everybody else as well, make sure you guys subscribe over on Apple Podcasts. Again, just look up Conversations with Jeff, and that way you guys will be notified every time there's something new that comes out. And then to check out all the rest of the articles and podcasts that we carry here on the GK Podcast Network, go to gatekeepersonline.com, and we'll catch you guys next time.